Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the To Be Like Christ Bible study of the Gospel of Luke. We are picking up in Luke chapter 2, verse 22. We're going to go through verse 24 today, so just 3 verses, but a lot of material to cover in these 3 verses. If you don't have the notes already, you can get a copy on Amazon.com or on our website. Links down in the description below, as well as some other information down there. Most of chapter 2 has been devoted so far to Jesus' birth. He's been born in Bethlehem, put inside the manger in swaddling clothing. A lot of us know that story. So that takes us through verse 20. Then verse 21 is about 8 days after Jesus was born. He was named and then he was circumcised, just like all Jewish males. And that was a part of the sign of the covenant that God had made with Abraham, who was the father of the Jews, way, way back in time. Anyway. We now come to verses 22 through 24. This takes place about a month after Jesus is born. So let's read these. And when the time came for their purification, that's, let me give you some info about what we're about to read, because we're just picking up in the middle of the text. So Mary and Joseph, they are going to go to Jerusalem to keep a commandment that was written in the old law in regards to childbirth. There were some sacrifices and some purifications and different things that were supposed to happen when a woman bore a child. So they're headed to Jerusalem for that purpose, to be obedient to God's law. Okay, verse 22. And when the time came for their purification according to the law of Moses, they, that's Joseph and Mary, brought him, Jesus, to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer sacrifices according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Okay, so a bit of time has gone by since Jesus was born, about a month. And in order to understand what's going on exactly here, we need to understand a little bit about the Old Testament laws, because that's what Joseph and Mary were trying to abide by here. And that brings up a good point. You can read about a lot of these Old Testament laws, these Jewish laws, in books like Leviticus. And a lot of people look at Leviticus and they're like, oh man, that book is really boring, because it's just a bunch of all the minutiae and the details about what it took for a Jew to follow the law. And you're like, this isn't relevant to me today. Why do I have to read this, right? But why should I read Leviticus and try to understand it? Well, the reason is because God didn't just come up with the new covenant, the New Testament, out of nowhere. It's the fulfillment of the Old Testament law. And when God designed the Old Testament law that was only for the Jews, he designed it, he designed it to foreshadow what was to come, right? It was supposed to be leading people to a fuller, a better covenant that God would later give to the world after Jesus came and died for the world. And so you'll have a richer and fuller understanding of God's work across the ages if you understand the New Testament, but have your understanding of the New Testament built off of what God did in the past in the Old. So that's why it's important to read books like Leviticus, and that's why we're going to go back and take a look at exactly what Joseph and Mary were doing here with what's described in verses 22 through 24. Okay, on with it then. The book of Leviticus, chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, is where you can read about God's laws for childbirth. When a male child was born to a Jewish family, the mother was considered ceremonially unclean for 7 days. God gave the Jews these rules about being clean and unclean, and you were allowed to do certain things if you were clean and weren't allowed to do certain things if you were unclean. And the Jews, ideally they would stay in a clean state. But there were certain things that could cause a person to be unclean, and the blood associated with childbirth was one of the things that God said made a person unclean. Now, be careful when you think about cleanliness and uncleanliness, because for a long time I kind of associated it with if a person was unclean, they were sinful, and if they were clean, they were righteous. And that's not necessarily the case. A person could be unclean and not sin. Childbirth is a perfect example. I mean, God thought a lot of childbirth. He calls children a blessing. He even gave some commands in certain places of the Bible for people to be fruitful and multiply and to have children, right? So it wasn't wrong to have children, but yet it still made a person unclean. So it's not always the case that a person had to sin to be unclean. So just be careful. I don't know if anyone else is confused about that like I had been in the past, but just a note for clarification. Okay, so anyway, when a male child was born, the mother was unclean for 7 days. And on the 8th day, the child was supposed to be circumcised. Now, if it was a male child, in addition to that 7 days of uncleanliness, the mother had 33 additional days of uncleanliness, so a total of 40. Right? If it was a female, it was like 66 days plus 2 weeks. It was actually a lot longer, I think more than double. But if it was a male, 40 days total of uncleanliness. So in Mary's case, she was ritually unclean for 40 days following the delivery of Jesus. And when the 40 days were complete, Mary went to Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice at the temple. That's what's being described in verses 22 and 24. And this sacrifice is described in Leviticus chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. Let me read this to you. And when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priests at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law of her who bears a child, either male or female. And if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priests shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. Okay, so those who had money, they were supposed to bring a lamb and a bird to be sacrificed so that they could become clean again. If someone didn't have a lot of money, God made arrangements that they could just bring 2 birds, which would have been cheaper than, a lamb. And they could just offer those 2. And I'm not sure that we can know for sure, but it really seems like Luke is implying that Mary and Joseph brought the 2 birds. Therefore they didn't have a lot of money. And he doesn't say that explicitly if you read the text carefully. You see in verse at the end of verse 24. And to offer sacrifices according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So you notice he quotes the sacrifice for the poor rather than the sacrifice for the well-off, seeming to suggest that that's what they gave. And I think based on kind of the other details that we know about them, that seems to fit. And I think that's worthy of note, and also there's some application that we can take from that. In the scriptures, in the Old Testament and in the New, God repeatedly shows his care and concern for poor people, and he accounted for them in his laws in the Old Testament. He's not this God who demands that you give a certain amount no matter what your economic situation is. That's really never been his rules for his servants. Right? It's always based on what a person has. Even in the New Covenant, when it talks about giving, it talks about giving of our means and giving what we can. He doesn't say, you have to give me $100. It's based on what a person has been blessed with. Unlike some, preachers out there who are collecting money from the poor and the rich, and they don't care how much they have to extort out of somebody or how much hardship they have to impose on somebody. They want to get their money. That's not the kind of God that we serve. God repeatedly, in the Old Testament especially, condemned people who mistreated the poor, like widows and orphans and those less fortunate. I think that's really important because even in today's culture, and I think probably throughout all of human history, and myself included, I have things to learn from this. And I trend towards this sometimes. Men and women have a tendency to look down on people that are poor. But God honored the poor when he determined that a poor family in Nazareth was going to raise a king. In chapter 1, Mary praised God for honoring the poor. She was humble. She wasn't really of any significance. People didn't think highly of her, and yet God had given her this tremendous honor. And I think sometimes we look at poor people and we say, oh, well, if they had been a little smarter, they wouldn't be in that situation. They had been more careful, they wouldn't have gotten themselves in that situation. They could be better off, right? It's real easy to look down on people and say, well, they should have done this, and the only reason they're poor, it's their own fault. But I think we should be careful about doing that, and certainly not allow that just to be our default response whenever we come across a situation that we don't know the details of, right? If the eyes of God looked into a poor home in Nazareth and deemed it fit to raise the King of Glory, let's think twice before our eyes look down on the poor. When we look at verse 23, let me read that again. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. Mary and Joseph were going to Jerusalem in order to do complete God's commands in regards to this. And there's this concept that the firstborn is holy to the Lord. According to God in the Old Testament, all firstborn males, both human and animals, belonged to him. Right? So the firstborn of sheep and oxen, they all belong to him. And God instructed that certain animals, like sheep and oxen, be sacrificed to him. So if you were the firstborn sheep or ox, you're out of luck. You're getting sacrificed because God, you're devoted to the Lord. And this was the responsibility of all of these Jewish households if animals were born in their stables. Other animals got off the hook a little bit easier. They could be redeemed, and we've talked about that word in another study. It means to buy back. They could be redeemed with money. So it was almost like the person, let's say I own a donkey, and it's, my donkey bears a baby donkey. And it's almost as if, God basically said that firstborn baby donkey is mine. Now you can buy it back from me and use it for your purposes, but it belongs to me at first, and you must buy it back. And so anything firstborn belonged to God, and it either needed to be sacrificed or a sacrifice of money needed to be given to God so that you could buy it back from him. It's a really interesting concept, and one that I hadn't really looked into a whole lot before I studied for this. It's described in Numbers chapter 18, verses 15 through 17, because this was also relevant for children. So if a firstborn son belonged to God and had to be bought back from him. Numbers 18, 15 through 17 reads, "Everything that opens the womb of all flesh, whether man or beast, which they offer to the Lord, shall be yours. Nevertheless, the firstborn of man you shall redeem, and the firstborn of unclean animals you shall redeem. And their redemption price, at a month old, you shall redeem them. You shall fix at 5 shekels in silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, which is 20 gerahs. But the firstborn of a cow, or the firstborn of a sheep, or the firstborn of a goat, you shall not redeem. They are holy. You shall sprinkle their blood on the altar, and shall burn their fat as a food offering, with pleasing aroma to the Lord." Okay, so this is kind of a weird concept, and at least it's foreign to us, that everything firstborn belonged to God and had to be sacrificed or bought back. Why was this part of God's law? Did he just want their money? And the answer to that is no. There's actually a reason for this. It was to remind the Israelites of the way that God had delivered them from slavery in Egypt. So Exodus chapter 13, verses 14 through 15 describe this. And when in time to come your sons ask you, "What does this mean?" Okay, so they're asking, what does it mean that we redeem the firstborn? Father, why do we do this? When they ask that question, you shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. Again, to understand this, we need to know some Old Testament. So in the book of Exodus, when the children of Israel were in slavery in Egypt, God delivered them through the 10 plagues, using the 10 plagues. The final plague was the death of all of the firstborn in Egypt. Animals, humans, everything. But God provided a way for the Israelites to escape and be saved from that plague so that their firstborn didn't die. And so the redeeming of the firstborn that was supposed to be practiced, it was meant to remind the people of what God had done for them. So it was a memorial of sorts. And just kind of a side note here, but this redeeming is actually still practiced by some modern Jews. I don't exactly know, how it's done, but they pay a redeeming price for their children. I don't know about their animals. Not too many people have animals, anymore, but they pay some kind of redeeming price, maybe to the synagogue, to buy back the firstborn, which I thought was interesting. Okay, so let's try to bring this home, I guess. So we've talked about all this Old Testament stuff, but we say all that to say that this is what Joseph and Mary were doing in going to Jerusalem. It was part of the old law. Every Jew had to do it when they had a child, and that's what they were going to do. So 40 days after Jesus' birth, Joseph and Mary went to Jerusalem to make the sacrifices of the 2 turtle doves, or the 2 pigeons, and to pay the redeeming price for their son. Now, we don't know if they did all of this in one day. Maybe they did all of this on the 40th day. It's also possible that they showed up a little bit earlier than that they showed up exactly 1 month after Jesus was born, because you notice in Numbers chapter 18, verses 15 through 17, it says that the children were supposed to be redeemed 1 month after they're born. And so I don't know if this just could have been done all together on the 40th day, because that was, pretty close to a month, or if it had to be a month exactly. If it had to be a month exactly, they would have actually come to Jerusalem sooner, paid the redeeming price of 5 shekels on the 30th day, then had to wait for the purification of Mary to be over on the 40th day, and then they could have offered the sacrifice of the 2 birds. I think it's kind of complicated, but just know, that's what they were doing. Whatever day they did it, they got it done, and so they were obedient to the Old Testament law. And a final application here before we close, and that is that it's interesting that the Jews were required to pay a redeeming price for their firstborn. And the way that God chose to redeem mankind from sin and from Satan is through what? By offering his firstborn, Jesus, his only begotten son, to be the redeeming price, so that his blood could pay the price to redeem us all back. And all of us who are Christians, right, have been bought back by the sacrifice of Jesus. So again, we see that this really old, kind of complex and sort of confusing law that the Jews had to follow, it actually gives us a better understanding of what Jesus did for us as the Redeemer. And you think about it from a Jewish standpoint, if they were familiar with the Old Testament redeeming law, then the concept of Jesus redeeming them would have been a lot more familiar to them. They would have been able to connect those dots pretty easily. We don't connect those dots quite as well, because most of us are, coming from a non-Jewish background. But if we understand the Old Testament, we too can connect the dots on that and see God's plan stretching out through the ages. Well, that's all we got for today's study. Hope you enjoy. Hope you have an excellent, what day is it today? Wednesday. Hope you have an excellent Wednesday, middle of the week. And I'll see you guys tomorrow. We'll press on into verse 25 and beyond.